Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We have started in the new book, Ecclesiastes, and we're in chapter 1. And I kind of did an intro, and I kind of did a little intro last time just to sort of kind of give a theme of the book. But I'm going to get back to chapter 1, and let's get into chapter 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Now, as you look here, you see that um, I'm going to probably come back to this later on in chapter 2. I spent a little time dealing with show, kind of doing a contrast. Um, Solomon asked the question, and we're going to, as we move through this book, you're going to see his philosophical questions. And so what I did was last time kind of answered the question with First Corinthians chapter 13, better known as the love chapter, but I'm not going to go further in that. All right, so I'll start at verse 1 again, and then it says, excuse me, the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, absolute futility, says the teacher. And I kind of dealt with the difference in teacher and the preacher, the difference in fertility and vanity. I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so it uses teacher and fertility as opposed to vanity and preacher, but they say the same thing. They mean the same thing. Vanity is emptiness. In other words, it's absolute fertility. You think it means something, and you get to the end of that. Now what? What does it absolutely mean? And he's asking this, he's posing this in terms of life. We could even say, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? Now he's asking it also, what is the purpose of life when you do all these things that life that you're supposed to do? If you achieve all that you're supposed to achieve, so what at the end, what is it? And his statement is, it is fertility, it is vanity. Verse 3, what does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors under the sun? And so I threw a answer to that, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Much if it's done in love. Verse 4, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Now, generation represents men. And I also say that generations would also mean a generation is a group of people who are born around the same time. Okay. Um, which is kind of interesting. How do you kind of lock in a generation? How do you define a generation? For some reason, too, there was this idea that a generation was 40 years. Remember, many years ago, a lot of people thought a generation was 40 years. And they really thought that when Israel became a nation, and then they put a countdown clock to say, well, since a generation is 40 years, and if Israel became a nation in 1947, then that means in 1987, game over. Well, game is not over. It hasn't been over. Okay. By that clock, we'd have been two generations after, when Jesus said the generation that see these things to come to pass. Okay. Well, again, I'm not going to get into prophecy, but there was a lot of misinterpretation there, apparently. But if you look at, for example, myself, I'm a generation. And then my children is a generation. Then my grandchildren is a generation. That's three generations. That's how you look at a generation. Okay. So now, how do you look at it so you can look at it from the standpoint from a family perspective for sure. Then you can look at it from the standpoint of for example, I got three, I got this, I have seven siblings, well, six siblings, and then you can almost say, how do I count a generation with among them? Because there are three olders and therefore youngers. So how does that count? Don't know. But I think the most part is that one generation is that, for example, I'm a generation, as I said, and then my children are a generation, and then my grandchildren is a generation. That's 3 generations. So when he says the generation goes, now generations can be broader than that, without a doubt. For example, what is called baby boomer, that's a generation. People who were born with a set in a kind of time frame. Then after that, I'm trying to think, what do they call the generation after baby boomers? In other words, and in fact, how we kind of look at it is each generation can be have that kind of a name to it too. Millennials, Gen X, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Then it says the generation goes and generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Verse 5, the sun rises and the sun sets, panting, and it returns to its place. Now, we know what's interesting. Remember too, during this time, when you look at these phrases, what's kind of interesting, we have, because of science, we have a better understanding. We know that the sun does rise. In other words, that's a true statement, right? Because if you're looking at the sun, you will see the sun come up from the east, and you will see that it will set, right? It'll disappear below the horizon in the west. We know that's an orbit. We know in the sense now how that orbit works. We know why it looks like the sun rises and sets, because of the tilt of the earth and the rotation of the earth. Verse 6. Verse 5 again. The sun rises and the sun sets, panting, it returns to its place where it rises. Verse 6. Gusting to the south, turning to the north, turning goes the wind. We also know all of this science, we have a better understanding in terms of wind right now. In fact, like now, they can predict, meteorologists can predict, the wind patterns for the next couple of days. So it says, gusting to the south, turning to the north, turning goes the wind, and the wind returns in its cycle. Verse 7, all the streams flow to the sea, yet the sea is never full. The streams are flowing to the place, and they flow there again. Now, excuse me, again, we can understand this now by the hydrological cycle. In other words, there's evaporation is why when it says that the seas are never full. They're full as the hydrological cycles are designed for it. Verse 8, all things are wearisome. Man is unable to speak. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled by hearing. That's interesting. If you think about it, you go up, get a nice view of anywhere, and you just stare at it. Literally, you can just stare at it. Sometimes when I'm watching television, and I kind of, most of the time when I watch television, I record stuff, and so when I'm watching it, sometimes you have aerial shots of cities, aerial shots of cities. I'll pause it and just stare at it. I'll just stare at the landmass. Verse number 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done, it will be done. It is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, again, how do we take that? Because there's always new stuff. For example, technology is new. But what does he mean by that? In the sense of the essence of what he means is true, right? If you look at when it was created, the newness of it wears off. It becomes something else. Nothing is new. So he's not talking about that we won't invent new things, new clothes, But on the other hand, isn't it interesting how fashion comes around again? Isn't it interesting that with the technology, man himself never changes? that man himself always kind of falls in the same patterns. Man himself does the same things. Verse 10, can one say about anything, look, this is new? Now, again, other than technology, and we would agree that yes, technology is new. Can man, for example, is there going to be technology where there's going to be trips to the moon? Wouldn't doubt it. Could we live on the moon? We'll see if God permits. Okay. Um, but we know right now the technology is new. The technology is always developing. I'm old enough to remember 8 tracks. You would never ever be satisfied with an 8 track right now. Because the 8 track, you couldn't rewind it. Once you put it in, it has to play all the way out. That's the way 8 tracks go. See, I'm old enough to remember that. Remember what they call it, the pump pile? You would never have that. What 8 tracks is to cassette and VCRs, the Apple phone, the pump pile, you would never have that right now. The iPhone, right? Will there be even more development or technology to come? Sure. They're already talking about AI technology. AI technology. All right. So, and what is interesting about this, notice that can one say about anything, look, this is new? It has already existed in the ages before us. Again, how do we do that? The nature of man, because certainly iPhones did not exist 200 years ago. Verse 11. There is no remembrance of those who came before, and of those who will come after. There will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. Now that's true. Other than history book, if you didn't have history books of certain people, right? You don't know half the people that lived in 1849. I just threw that number out, right? Because unless there was somebody writing history, and even with the history right now, there are people right now who want to change history. How easily it is to just forget history, right? Okay, and for example, we got people denying the Holocaust. This is in kind of our lifetime, as you can say, and yet people are already January 6th, people are already denying that. Okay, verse 12. He says, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. Now, this is something that is more philosophical, right? Now, remember, Solomon, God gave him wisdom and he became the wisest man. But I want you to see now from his perspective. He said, God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied, right? Now, notice this particular perspective here. And this was the man whom you could say, again, he was the wisest man that God had given him. Wealth. He had everything in life that you could think. He says, I have seen all things that are done under the sun, and have found everything to be fruitful and pursuant and the pursuit of the wind. So notice his perspective. Think about his perspective here. And this is a man who has all things. Remember, people came from all around the world to have an audience with him. He traveled. So what is interesting now that I'm going to put a challenge out to just think of all of the rich people. And at some point to me, they'll come to this particular point here. Whether they admit it or not, I think they'll come to this point. Verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened, what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were um okay, it says I have amassed wisdom. Let me do this here. Look, I said to myself, look, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were over Jerusalem before me. Now, in reality, there's only two people over Jerusalem. Now, if you wanted to count it, the pagan kings, David, in terms of the kings of Israel, well, actually, he says Jerusalem, so that would only be his father, David. So he says, look, I've amassed wisdom far beyond all those who are over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I apply my mind to know wisdom and knowledge. And then he says, madness and folly. And I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. In other words, he's going to see the point of the pursuit of the wind is grabbing at the wind. Can you as a mere person grab air? Verse 18 says, for with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increased, grief increased. Now that's kind of interesting. That's interesting, his perspective here. Notice what he says. Grief with much wisdom. And again, this is coming from a man he was the wisest man ever. In other words, to date, there has never been a man more wiser than Solomon. Other than Jesus. Other than Jesus. Jesus was here only 33 years, and of course he had a singular purpose, but nevertheless, Jesus, the man, was of course wiser than Solomon. If you wanted to compare Jesus with Solomon, you certainly could say that their outcomes on life were different. If you wanted to compare Solomon, if you wanted to compare Solomon with Jesus, Solomon here is saying the futility, the vanity of this life, no matter what you do, it's empty. You come up empty. That's his point. You come up empty. We're going to see even in the next chapter that no matter what you think, if you think that I'm going to achieve total serenity, peace, just by this life, that's his point. You could never do it. You could never. And then he says, the more I got, it was like it did not fulfill me. Now, don't get me wrong, I would certainly love to be incredibly rich in that situation. You know, I like to be Jeff Bezos, have a couple of $100 billion to go. Oh, I'm miserable. In other words, I don't say that lightly because basically he's going to say the same thing. Rich, poor, it's still vanity. So I'd rather be rich, but I'm not. So, um, um, of course, in the New Testament, it does answer these questions. That there is a peace that surpasses all understanding. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. Till next time, I'll see you in the next study.